Netflix's Three Body Problem series is one of two major adaptations of Liu Cixin's popular series of the same name. Sorry, 3 adaptations. 4 adaptations? 5 adaptations? Do we really need 5 adaptations of the same book series at the same time? One of these adaptations was a Chinese language adaptation created by Tencent, and that released a little over a year ago now. Throughout this review, I'm going to be comparing the Netflix series and the Tencent series a lot, and I think that's kind of inevitable because they took very different approaches to adapting the source material, and I think comparing them sheds a little bit of light on the specific creative decisions that went into both the Netflix and the Tencent versions of this story. Also, this video is sponsored by Shortform, but more on that in just a little bit. Anyway, the Netflix series is mostly an adaptation of the first book in the trilogy, but it also covers elements of the second and third book as well, and it also came out like 3 months ago, and I'm just now getting around to reviewing it. Sorry about that. I basically promised to make a video on this series last year when I speculated about whether or not it would be any good, and I haven't yet fulfilled that promise, so here I am. Because it took me a long time to get around to actually watching this series, I heard a lot of chatter about it online, and the way some people were talking about it made it sound like it was one of the worst adaptations in history, which made me not super excited to watch it. So I was pleasantly surprised when it turned out to be actually not that bad and a genuinely fun watch. Who would have thought that trusting internet negativity would lead me astray? Even though I still think I do prefer the Tencent show overall, there are plenty of reasons why one might prefer this adaptation over that one, and there are even at least a couple places where some aspects of the book were improved in this adaptation. However, with that being said, the television format as opposed to the book format has some inherent limitations, and as a result, due to the nature of this story, I think the television show is a lot less interesting to watch than the books are to read. In a television show, you kind of have to have characters and drama take center stage as opposed to science fiction concepts, which are really what the books are all about. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with focusing on drama. It makes sense for this adaptation, and some of the drama is genuinely good, and I really cared about the characters by the end of the show. However, it does feel like there's something of a disconnect between this drama and the literal ideas that the show is exploring, which, when they come from the books, are still quite rich. But whenever the show strays away from the books and starts introducing its own new concepts, that's where some of the weaknesses become apparent. Some of these concepts are also incredibly difficult to portray on screen in an interesting way, and so a lot of nuance is lost as a result. Ultimately, I don't want to say that the show did the best job it could possibly do in adapting the source material, and I'll get into why in a bit, but I do think the inherent limitations of a limited 8-episode Netflix series can explain some of the show's shortcomings compared to the books. Anyway, that's about all I can say without giving spoilers. The rest of this review will spoil the entire first season, along with the entire first book, and parts of the second and third book as well. I won't discuss major plot points in the latter 2 books until the end of this video when I get into speculation about future seasons, but because of the way the timelines are all shuffled around, I can't really avoid talking about them. So Netflix took a very different approach to adapting this series than the other Chinese language version of the series adapted by Tencent about a year ago. Whereas in the Tencent version, for the most part, all the characters and plotlines are adapted almost directly from the book, as if they jumped off the page. In the Netflix adaptation, almost all the characters are different. The only exception to this rule is the plotline that takes place in the 1960s, the one focused on Ye Wenjie. The opening scene of the Netflix series, in fact, is the scene in which Ye Wenjie's father is killed in a struggle session during the Cultural Revolution. What's interesting about putting this scene first is that this is originally what Liu Cixin wanted to do when publishing the book in China, but he wasn't allowed to do that, and so the scene got kind of pushed to the middle of the book. But then when it was published in English some years later, it got pushed to the beginning again because that's what Liu originally wanted. So opening with this scene does seem to be true to the author's original intention, and it is nice to see this scene because it was completely cut out of the Tencent adaptation, even though it was filmed. This scene in both the book and in this show does play a pretty critical role in shaping Ye's motivations going forward. However, I think it is interesting that despite this series including this scene and the Tencent version excluding it, Ye still feels like a much more developed and interesting character in the Tencent version of the show. The major change I think made in this plotline is that Ye is a lot less sure of herself and positions a lot more as a villain as opposed to a tragic figure. You can see evidence of this, for example, in how the timelines have shifted around. In both the book and the Tencent show, for instance, there were a lot of things that happened to Ye after she sent the message to Tri-Solaris asking them to come to Earth that made her reassess her opinion of humanity. For instance, she tried to get closure with the Red Guards who killed her father, after sending that message. And she also spent some time living in a village near Red Coast Base and being cared for by the local villagers when she fell ill. All of this means that by the time you get to the present-day plotline, Ye's feelings about her actions and the Trisolaran invasion are complicated, to say the least. But some of that nuance is lost here in the Netflix show. For example, when Ye confronts the Red Guards who killed her father, this happens before she sent the message, and because the Red Guards refused to repent for what they had done, her hatred of humanity as a whole is only fueled. This is also compounded by the fact that she meets Mike Evans before sending her message, and witnesses all the environmental destruction that he's fighting. Basically, in the Netflix show, Ye has all these experiences even on top of witnessing her father's death, so that by the time she actually sends her message, she doesn't hesitate about it at all. And after she sends her message, this plotline is pretty much cut off. There are a few more flashbacks showing how her relationship with Mike Evans developed, but overall, we don't really get to see her regret her actions or rethink them, at least until the very, very end, and then only dubiously. As a side note, I think making Ye Wenjie and Mike Evans be in a romantic relationship was a really dumb decision, but it's Hollywood, so I don't really know what you can do. I think this was a real missed opportunity for the Netflix show because in the Tencent show and in the books, there was a lot of really compelling drama that came out of Ye being a more nuanced character. Like, for instance, when she had to kill her husband just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time to prevent him from finding out about her sending the message. Ye's reassessment of her actions is also what leads to the split between the Redemptionists and the Adventists, these being two factions within the ETO, or Earth Trisolaris organization, which seems to be unnamed in the show for some reason. The Redemptionists being the people who want the Santi, or Trisolarans, to come to Earth and take over completely, and the Redemptionists being people who want to help the Santi solve the three-body problem so they don't have to come to Earth. In the Netflix show, these distinctions are all erased, and the ETO just kind of becomes one hegemonic base of evil. I understand for the sake of brevity why they cut this plotline, but it just makes the characters seem less interesting. And I also do think the Redemptionist position makes a lot of sense. Like, if you find an alien civilization in distress, you might want to help them without literally inviting them to come over to Earth and destroy civilization. Back to the past Ye Wenjie plotline though, if I can compare it once more to the Tencent adaptation, it's interesting that there were a lot of scenes in this adaptation which were very similar to the Tencent adaptation, but which were underwhelming by comparison. One scene, for instance, is the scene where Ye arrives at Red Coast Base. In the Tencent show, this is a very dramatic moment. It's dramatic visually because she arrives at night in a helicopter in the snow, and, you know, it just looks cool. But it's also emotionally dramatic because when Ye is confronted with the decision to either stay in Red Coast Base the rest of her life and basically forfeit her freedom in order to work there, or to give up the chance to work on Red Coast Base and have a chance at earning her freedom later, Ye has to really think about this decision. It's a really dramatic moment. Then when she does finally accept to work on the base, there's a whole montage establishing the scale of it, and it all just feels really intimidating. Compare this to the Netflix version, where she arrives just kind of at a small gate in the middle of the day in a scene with very flat and boring lighting. And then when confronted with the decision to either work at Red Coast Base the rest of her life or have a chance to earn her freedom later, she just immediately decides to work at the base without thinking about it at all. In fact, we don't even really know what her thought process is at that moment because at this point she's not a very well-established character. In fact, I think this scene is the first time in the show that we ever have mention of her being an astrophysicist, which is just insane. It feels like with everything that happened to her and her being a criminal, this decision to have her work at a top-secret military base comes out of nowhere, at least with no prior knowledge on the part of the audience of her being a genius scientist. Anyway, I say all this because even though the Tencent show can be really over the top at times, like in this scene where Ye dramatically falls in slow motion into a pile of snow, I think this is one case where the melodrama helped you care about the characters a lot more, and the Netflix show kind of stripping out the melodrama and making this scene feel much more clinical is an example of a trend, I think, in this adaptation. However, I'm giving all these criticisms. I should say that I don't hate everything about this plotline at all. I think the actress who played Ye was perfect for what she was in this version of the story. Instead of being a more sympathetic, tragic figure, here she's bitter and sullen, but also determined and really intelligent, and I think that the actress captured that well. In general, I also get the impression that the Mandarin-speaking actors in this adaptation were better than the English-speaking actors in the Tencent adaptation, but admittedly that is a pretty low bar.
For the parts above the ship, however, above the waterline, however,
I think it is also a testament to the power of the storytelling in the original novel that despite all these changes, there are still plenty of scenes that in both the Tencent and Netflix version are, as I said, almost exactly the same. Like, for example, the montage where Ye is reading Silent Spring while working in the camp in the forest. The vibes are pretty much exactly the same in both adaptations. And speaking of Silent Spring is a really important book in the Three Body Problem that goes on to shape Ye's motivations and encourages her to send her message to the Santi. But I have to say that when I first read the book, I didn't really know much about this book or why it was so important. Fortunately, that's no longer the case thanks to today's sponsor, Shortform. Shortform is a service that provides really high-quality summaries and analysis of popular or influential books, especially nonfiction books. And in my experience with using the service, I found that it does a fantastic job breaking down the main points of a book into an easily digestible format while also not skipping on nuance or depth. For instance, I recently read and really enjoyed Shortform's analysis of Silent Spring, which does a great job of not only breaking down Rachel Carson's points about the ineffectiveness and wastefulness of industrial pesticides and herbicides, but also puts the book in historical context and highlights how many of the problems Carson brought attention to in the 60s continue to persist today. There are also tons of other great books on Shortform, of course. Biographies, books on history and science and philosophy. Of course, I should be clear, Shortform is not a replacement for reading entire books. But the reason I can really recommend this service is because I think it's incredibly useful to familiarize yourself with a wide range of authors and arguments, including arguments that you might disagree with. Also, it's worth noting that Shortform adds new books every week, and that subscribers can vote on which books are added to the platform next. Anyway, if all of that sounds interesting to you, to get a 5-day free trial, you can join Shortform via my special link or through the link in the description. And you can also get 20% off an annual subscription. Thank you so much to Shortform for sponsoring, and now back to the review. So now I come to the part of the review where I discuss the actually big changes, and these were the changes that made during the present day plotline. In this plotline, pretty much all the characters are different. They don't have the same names as their book counterparts, and some of them fulfill similar roles, some of them don't really fulfill any roles from the book. This was one of the things I was a little bit concerned about with this adaptation because, as many people know, the creators of this show, who also created Game of Thrones, tend to create better material when they stick closer to the book. And by changing all the characters around and adding in their own stuff, there's a chance of, you know, creating something not as good. Overall, though, I don't hate what they did with the characters. There is a general trend in this adaptation to make the characters seem kind of quote-unquote cool, as opposed to their book counterparts, presumably to appeal to the very different expectations an American audience might have. But perhaps one of the biggest changes is the fact that all of these characters know each other and have been best friends for a long time. The equivalents of all these characters in the books didn't really interact with each other at all. All of them come from different books, and for the most part, they only had passing interactions with each other, if they had any interactions with each other. And for the first few episodes, I was kind of skeptical of this creative direction of having the main characters all be best friends with each other, because for one thing, that's just a lot of characters to introduce at the very beginning of your series. There's something like 5 or 6 main characters introduced in the first episodes, and you don't really care about them much at first because there's just too many of them. But aside from that, whenever you have all the important characters in your story, especially when it's a really global story like this, be best friends with each other, you can make the world inadvertently feel small. However, I will say that once I started to become a little bit more familiar with the characters, I started to understand more what the writers were trying to do. They're taking a sort of Wheel of Time-esque approach to storytelling, where they have a really small group of friends have an outsized impact on the world around them, all going in their own directions and having their own plot lines, but still kind of maintaining that cozy, warm, you know, close friends feeling. I really like the way that dynamic plays out in the Wheel of Time books, and so I think it would be a bit hypocritical for me to say it's inherently bad. Also, I did love that all the characters are always talking about Oxford, because I spent a semester studying abroad at a college in Oxford, and so whenever they talked about Oxford stuff, I was like, oh yeah, I know that pub, I know what they're talking about. That was fun. The portrayal of the characters as scientists, however, was a bit iffy. Sometimes in their attempts to establish that these characters are really smart, the writers go out of their way to make them seem cold and condescending, and it just feels kind of cringy. Like in the scene where Augie and Jen are introduced, they meet this guy at the bar and kind of rattle off these extremely techno-babbly job descriptions at him in order to, you know, kind of ward him off, I guess. But it feels like it's part of this trend where scientists in media are portrayed as being so off-puttingly intelligent that they can't partake in a normal conversation without coming across as condescending. And I don't really know what to say about that except The Big Bang Theory and its consequences. Okay, so now let's discuss some specific characters. Augie Salazar. Augie Salazar is the equivalent of the book character of Wang Miao. She is a nanomaterials researcher who plays a crucial role in developing the flying blade nanomaterials that obviously have quite a big influence on the plot of this season. There was quite a lot of discussion about this character online, and in fact the backlash to this character was so extreme that the actress herself had to clarify that the character was meant to be unlikable. So I went into the show thinking that this character was just going to be like the worst and most annoying person ever. But then she wasn't. A lot of the reasons I've heard people saying for why they hate this character, I just don't buy. One of the most egregious examples is that it's unrealistic for an esteemed scientist to be looking like a supermodel. And I don't know, this critique is just like barely concealed misogyny. People have also pointed out that it's annoying that she spends the entire second half of the season moaning and groaning about having killed a bunch of children with her invention. And what? I think her reaction to what happened in the Panama Canal was perfectly reasonable, and I would have been very disappointed if she just kind of brushed it off and didn't think about it the rest of the season. Overall, I really don't think she's that bad of a character at all. The writers, as I said earlier, clearly go out of their way to make her seem kind of cool and standoffish, but she has a real character arc in this season, and at the end of the season, after experiencing the trauma of what happened in the Panama Canal, she decides to use her technology for good, to help people. I will say that I do generally still prefer Wang Miao as a protagonist, especially in the Tencent version, where he kind of represents doomerism and existentialism and mortal terror. But I don't think Augie is a bad replacement as far as replacements could go. Character-wise, I think one of the most enjoyable aspects of this show, at least for me, was the storyline surrounding Will Downing and Jen Chang. These two characters are the equivalents of Yun Tianming and Cheng Shen from the books, and a large part of why I enjoyed this plotline in the show is because of the changes they made from the storyline in the books. You see, in the books, Yun Tianming and Cheng Shen barely even knew each other before the whole staircase project thing where Yun Tianming's brain got launched into space. It's said that Tianming knew Cheng Shen in college, but even then, only barely, and he hadn't spoken to her in years by the time of the staircase project. And so, frankly, the way he pined after her in the books was a little more strange and a little less wholesome. There's one scene, in fact, where he specifically goes to their old college and just waits on the campus hoping to see her passing by, even though he hasn't spoken to her in years. It's just weird. And there's nothing wrong necessarily with centering a story around that kind of character if you want to portray them as being a bit of a creep. But within the context of the books, we're still clearly meant to think that these two characters are star-crossed lovers, and their relationship defines a lot of what happens later on in the series. This is part of a general trend in the books where Liu Cixin's female characters are the worst written characters in the series, and for all the people who noticed this and complained about it in the English language versions, it's even worse if you read literal translations of the Chinese versions of the text. All of which is to say that it makes sense to update this plotline. And I'm glad they did. In this version of the story, Will and Jen have known each other their entire lives. They're good friends and part of a shared friend group. They bring in motifs that symbolize their friendship, which will be very important later on, including the paper boat and the fairy tales. If you've read the books, you know why this stuff is important, and I think it's cool that they're foreshadowing it, because in the books, it wasn't foreshadowed at all. In fact, in a scene in Book 3 where Tianming is reminiscing with Cheng Shen about fairy tales they used to tell each other, he's just lying. They didn't actually share fairy tales with each other. And in this version of the story, they did. And so I think that's a nice and welcome change. This whole plotline really reaches its payoff in episode 7, which for me was one of the best episodes in the series, partly because I was watching events I'd never seen adapted to television before. The first 5 episodes were all like a recap of the Tencent show for me, but also because I really liked how this plotline was handled, and especially the euthanasia scene with Yun Tianming, or Will Downing. I'm gonna keep getting their names wrong. This is a pretty close adaptation of a similar scene from the books, which I always thought was a very underrated scene, and so I was glad to see it brought to life here, albeit in a somewhat different way. In this version of the story, Will Downing has a friend with him. In the other version, he was alone. And in the other version of the story, he also didn't know about the staircase project when he was preparing to undergo euthanasia. What actually happened is that Cheng Shen came in at the last moment and stopped him just as he was about to press the button for the 5th time. And then that's how he went on to find out about the staircase project. So the chronology is a little bit different, but the vibes of the scene are very similar. And yeah, it was a powerful plotline. It was hard to watch, and the ending made me tear up, quite frankly. Seeing Will get worse and worse over the course of the season, struggling to find some happiness in what he believes are going to be the last days of his life while also not wanting to be a burden to his friends, it was well done. Now, Dasher is an interesting character for this adaptation. On the one hand, the casting of Benedict Wong for this character makes perfect sense. Like, if you take the physical description of the character from the books, Benedict Wong is an actor who matches that description perfectly. It's almost hard to think of another actor who could be as good for this role as he was. And yet at the same time, I was kind of disappointed with the portrayal of this character, and I think that's partly because of how the Tencent show has influenced me. In the Tencent show, Dashu is this wellspring of optimism and hope. He's kind of a foil to Wang Miao. He represents absurdism in a way. And he's disgruntled and blunt, to be sure, but he's also quite funny. There are multiple laugh-out-loud moments in that show, and the character is just very fun to watch. He's like a perfect counterpoint to Wang Miao. In this version of the story, all of the whimsy from this character is kind of stripped away, and he's just very disgruntled, very cool, as I've been saying about a lot of the characters in this show. He doesn't often crack jokes, and when he does, he just seems kind of tired while he's doing it. He also doesn't stand on his own as much as a character, because in this version of the story, he's working for Thomas Wade, who kind of overshadows him in every way. In the books, Dashu was the one who came up with the Panama Canal Plan, Operation Guzheng, and in the show, Thomas Wade kind of does that, and he also does everything else. Dasha has just kind of been reduced to the role of a glorified bodyguard. And so the whole time as I was watching this character, I was wondering, you know, what about the bug scene? Is he going to do the big speech where he talks about how humans, like bugs, are going to rise up against the Trisolarans and persevere in the face of oppression? Is it still going to be as good as it was in the book and the show and the other show? They did do the bug scene, in fact, but sure enough, it was kind of a disappointment. Now, I still want to be clear, I don't think this is the fault of the actor, really. I think he really was the perfect actor for this role. I just think the way he was written, he had so much of his charm stripped away from him that he couldn't be the same force of light and optimism as he was in the books. I don't know. I am interested to see how this character develops now that he's working more closely with Saul Durand. And I am interested in his relationship with his son as well. It sounds like his son is starting to explore ideas related to the philosophy of escapism, which is quite important in the second book, and I'm interested to see where that plotline goes. Anyway, speaking of Saul Durand, Saul is the equivalent of Luo Ji from the second book in the series, and he's mostly a pretty accurate rendition of this character. Unfortunately, he doesn't really have much to do this series, and that's partly a symptom of the problem I was talking about earlier, where when you introduce all the characters at the very beginning, some of them are inevitably going to feel like added weight until they have something to do. Saul spends most of the series just kind of hanging around until the last episode where he finally becomes a wall-facer. But I did like what we got of him. I like how he's portrayed as this scientist who has given up on making an impact on the world. He doesn't take anything seriously in his work or in his relationships. And this is all very accurate to how Luo Ji was introduced in the books. It is interesting that they cut out the whole imaginary girlfriend plotline from the books. This was another one of those really weird plotlines that a lot of book fans just like to pretend doesn't exist. Basically, Luo Ji in the books has this imaginary girlfriend that he makes up for himself, and he writes stories about her and pretends that he's going places with her. And it gets to the point where his mind is just like completely wrapped up in these delusions about this imaginary person. Given that all of that happened before he became a wall-facer in the books, it seems like they've just cut that plotline completely. And honestly, I think it makes sense. I think the replacement for all of that is going to be Saul's relationship with Augie. And I guess we'll see if he is able to take that seriously in the future or not. Also, as a bit of an aside, I also really liked the scene between Saul and Ye Wenjie. And I liked that her implications were a little bit more subtle this time around. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. Given the way this conversation went down in the books, I always found it a little bit hard to believe that Luo Ji couldn't put two and two together and figure out what Ye was trying to tell him. So it's nice that she's a little bit more subtle this time around. I'm trying my best here to avoid giving away any spoilers, but if you've read the books, you know. I also want to say a few words about Thomas Wade, because even though I dislike how he kind of overshadowed Dashi in this adaptation, I really loved how this character was portrayed. For one thing, I just love this character trope of the hyper-confident Machiavellian manipulator who is nonetheless like a child in comparison to the foe that they're going up against. This character was just very fun to watch on screen, and I like that they didn't try to make him likable or sympathetic. He's actively rude to the other characters and disrespectful of their wishes, and yet at the same time he is kind of exactly what Earth needs at the moment. he's willing to get his hands dirty and do morally questionable things in the service of defending the planet. He reminds me a lot of certain historical figures who were maybe not the best people, but who were also exactly what the world needed at that point in time, despite all the controversies that might surround them. So yeah, I thought it was really fun to see him portrayed on screen, and I'm excited to see how he develops. If I can get prematurely into a little bit of speculation, I'm not completely sure what to make of the scene where the Santi approach Wade directly and tell him that they're watching him and are supporting him in his endeavors. This scene didn't appear in the books, and so I think what might be happening is they're just trying to psychologically manipulate him into abandoning his plans by tricking him into thinking that he's playing directly into the Santi's hands. But I guess we'll just have to see. I need to move on to discussing some of the elements of the actual plot now, because I have rather a lot to say. The video game plotline is, I think, unquestionably one of the biggest areas where the Netflix show improves upon the books. And I know that might be a controversial thing to say, but hear me out. This plotline in the books made almost zero sense. In the books, this VR game that is used as a recruitment tool by the Earth Tri-Solaris organization is just a regular VR video game. There's a scene where Wang Miao just goes to the store, buys a VR headset, just a normal old VR headset, puts it on, and is transported into this other world. But the reason this feels weird is because that when he's in the game, it's never explained whether the other characters he's talking to are other players, or if they're just NPCs, or something else. It's also never explained why we should care about anything that's happening in the game, because sure, the game is mostly just meant to be a recruitment tool, but there are some scenes where Wang Miao is in quite a bit of danger. Like, for instance, there's one scene where he's going to be burned alive for heresy, and the entire time you're reading this, you're just thinking, why should I care? Can't he just take the VR headset off? It's like the equivalent of some 10-year-old bullying you in VR chat. Just take the headset off. Just take it off. The fact is, in the books, the whole VR game thing was just a plot device for exposition, and it wasn't really well thought out, especially in comparison to the other sci-fi aspects of the story. Also, one of the most ridiculous things about the VR game in the books is that whenever you log onto it, it says the name of the game, which is 3-Body, and I don't understand why any physicist would look at the name of that game and not immediately figure out that it's about the 3-Body problem. It's treated as a big revelation when Wang Miao finally figures out what the problem is that they're supposed to be trying to solve, but the game just tells you. Whenever you open up the game, it says, "Welcome to 3-Body." The Netflix show makes all of this make a lot more sense. For one thing, the game doesn't have a name, but for another thing, the game isn't run on an ordinary VR headset. Instead, it's a Tri-Solaran technology that's almost akin to magic. Whenever you put the VR headset on, all of your sensory inputs to the outside world are completely severed, and you're totally immersed in the game. You can feel everything that's happening to you in the game. And this makes everything that happened in the game feel like it has more stakes. Like when Jin and Jack are about to be boiled alive. Sure, the implication is that they can't feel the boiling water as if it was actually boiling water in real life. But the fact that they can't just take off the VR headset whenever they want makes this feel like they're in real danger. Now, of course, like every change in an adaptation, this has its downsides as well. Probably the biggest downside is that it makes no sense for these characters to just be totally okay with putting this foreign object on their heads. Like when Jin finds the headset for the first time, she knows it's connected to the death of her friend, the Yang Dong equivalent in this adaptation. And the first time she puts the headset on, she experiences firsthand that it completely cuts off her connection to the outside world and that she loses control over her body. And so I think it was incredibly stupid for both her and Jack to just be messing around with this headset. Like, I get curiosity, but this headset is clearly connected to a string of suspicious suicides, and whenever you put it on, you lose control of your body completely. It just seems like a bad idea. That's why I was relieved when Augie finally mentioned how stupid it was for them to be doing this. And, you know, yeah, I get it. They have to put the headsets on for the plot. It's just trade-offs, you know? However, the most important change made to the video game plotline by far is that it does a much better job than the books of clarifying what the purpose of the game actually is. See, in the books, the game feels rather impersonal. It's a way of presenting the history of Tri-Solaris, and also a way of encouraging scientists to solve the 3-Body problem, per the Redemptionist mission of helping the Tri-Solarans solve the problem in order to live in their system instead of coming to Earth. But in the TV show, in addition to the whole math element, the game is centered around one objective, which is saving a child. And this was such a smart decision. on the part of both the writers of the show and the Trisolarans. By giving the players what feels like a personal connection to this child every time they log on the game, and seeing this child die again and again, they start to become more and more obsessed of fulfilling this objective of saving the child. And I think the moment when everything clicked into place for me is when the girl stepped up and said, "You'll welcome us, won't you?" when referring to the pending Trisolaran invasion. As a manipulation tactic, it just makes so much sense. In this version of the story, there is no redemptionism. The ETO just wants to convince people to let the Trisolarans take over Earth willingly. And the best way to do that is by convincing them that this is a philanthropic action. Now, in the books, the game has exactly the same objective, but for some reason, you just never really buy it. The author just doesn't go into enough detail about why Wang Miao or any of the other people who are being recruited into the ETO care about the characters in this game. All of the focus is on solving the math problem. And so this one simple change of adding in a child and using the child as a stand-in for a Trisolaris as a whole, it's a really effective change, in my opinion. Now, with that being said, the math stuff is cool and I wish there was more of it. In the books, Wang Miao came up with many more theories before coming up with the Tri-Solar System theory. And it was really cool to see these increasingly complicated models of the universe develop. Liu Cixin clearly has an understanding of historical astronomy. In particular, in the books, there's a really cool 3D model of the Tri-Solar universe created by Moza. And we don't see that play out here at all. The whole plotline was very shortened, and we don't see as much of the actual process of solving the three-body problem. However, we did get that in the Tencent adaptation, so if only we could just like mix and match the best elements of both adaptations, put them together. Oh well, there are no perfect adaptations. I want to also briefly talk about the scientists committing suicide plot point, because I think this is potentially another area where the show improved upon the books. See, in the books, I always thought this plotline was one of the worst ideas the author came up with, and I think it fundamentally misunderstands how science and physics works. In the books, the reason scientists are killing themselves is because experiments have completely random results as a result of Sophon interference, and so they get the impression that everything they know about physics is wrong. Physics is broken, as they keep saying. And so, as a result of being unable to comprehend these experimental results, they all just lose the will to live and kill themselves. Here's the thing. In real life, if something like this happened, I'm not a scientist, but I suspect most scientists would be pretty excited. Science is not a system of beliefs. Science is a process. The scientific way of understanding the world is the process of making observations and asking questions and coming up with theories that fit those observations. If your theories don't fit the observations, then that just means your theories are wrong. It doesn't mean that physics as a whole is broken, it just means there's new physics that you haven't discovered yet. Nowadays, even though there is a lot of physics we haven't yet worked out, we basically understand the physics of everyday life in a lot of detail. And so if experimental results started coming out randomly like this, I think a lot of scientists would be eagerly getting to particle accelerators and publishing papers as fast as they could and trying to make breakthroughs. And even if the experimental results kept being random, I don't think that many would lose the will to live. Frankly, suicide is a very serious topic, and the idea that people would just kill themselves because of random experimental results, it just seems like a crass treatment of a very heavy subject matter. I would surely buy that some scientists would despair, but I wouldn't buy that it would be everyone in the entire world. And the whole Trisolaran plan in the books revolves around killing off all of the top scientists in the world so that Earth can't make progress. It's just a dumb idea. I don't like it very much. Now see, the suicide stuff still does happen in the Netflix show, but it's handled in a subtly different way. I get the impression in the show that the despair these scientists are facing is not so much a result of scientific experiments being random, but knowledge of the impending Trisolaran invasion. And in fact, in at least one case, with the character of Jack, we see that something that looks like a suicide is in fact a murder on the part of the ETO made to look like a suicide. And this opens up the possibility that maybe not all of these scientists were killing themselves after all. Maybe they were being systematically murdered by the ETO at the orders of the Santi in order to even further hinder humanity's scientific progress. Now, to be fair, I think I might be wrong in my interpretation here. It's never explicitly said that all of these suicides are in fact murders, but it is at least implied that this could be the case sometimes. And I think this is a nice way of subtly subverting this aspect of the books, which just never really made sense to me in the first place. Frankly, this was always kind of a headcanon of mine in the books, that the suicides were more about knowledge of the invasion and less about knowledge of the end of science, and so I'm glad to see it explored on screen. Okay, so I want to talk about Sophons. This is going to be kind of a rambly and nitpicky section, and I'm going to get very nerdy, I'm sorry, but I have at least a few things to say. For one thing, I think it's a real shame that the idea of there being hidden complex universes inside of protons was completely scrapped in this adaptation, because that was my favorite scene in the books, and it also was only barely alluded to in the Tencent adaptation, I think because of budgetary reasons. For those who haven't read the books, what happened in the books when the Santi were trying to unfold the proton is that they unfolded it into 3 dimensions instead of 2 dimensions, and then these giant floating shapes in the sky organized themselves into eyes and created a giant refractive lens that focused one of the suns onto the surface of the planet and like burned a bunch of cities on Trisolaris. And then when the Trisolaran leaders were discussing this, they said, well, what happened probably is that there were these entire civilizations inside of the proton, and now we just unfolded them into macroscopic space, and they're taking revenge on us for doing that. And then one of the other Trisolaran characters brought up that maybe there were some profound moral implications of this, that every time a proton is destroyed in a particle accelerator, this means that entire universes are being destroyed. But then the other Trisolaran leader is like, well, we're already going to invade another planet and completely displace their population and kill everyone, so what does it matter to us if we kill entire universes inside of protons? Who cares? Who cares? I love this scene because it just shows the ruthlessness of the Trisolarans, and it also hints at these deep hidden layers of reality in the world of the 3-body universe. The whole idea of there being hidden dimensions inside of subatomic particles comes from string theory, and so probably has no basis in real science, but it's such a cool concept, and I had never seen it explored before. It blew my mind when I read it in the books. It does make sense that it wasn't explored in the show, because here the characters are told the story of the unfolding of the Sophon via what's essentially a Trisolaran propaganda film. And so of course the Santi wouldn't want to show the mistakes they made while trying to make the Sophons. They wouldn't want to show that they accidentally caused a bunch of their cities to be destroyed by a gigantic eyeball in the sky. But I still think it's a shame. Another nitpick, the flickering universe scene where the Sophons make it seem like all the stars in the universe are flickering. This scene was really dumb in the show. I think the showrunners completely missed the point of this scene in the books. See, in the books, the quote-unquote flickering wasn't a literal flickering in the visible light spectrum, but was instead a flickering in the cosmic microwave background radiation. Obviously, this was all created by a massive Sophon wrapping itself around Earth after being unfolded in 2 dimensions and manipulating the cosmic microwave background. But the implication here, by encoding the numbers of Wang Miao's countdown inside the CMB, is that the entire universe is fake, essentially. This is a powerful statement to Wang Miao that he might as well be living in a simulation, that everything he thinks he knows is controlled by these powerful external forces and he can do nothing to stop it. In the show, instead, we just get stars doing a little flicker thing. And it just, for one thing, looks dumb. For another thing, there's a scene where Thomas Wade and Dashi are standing outside in the middle of London and observing this display, and I'm just like, how do you see any stars at all in the middle of London? Like, the fact that you can see any stars with all the light pollution there is itself more surprising than the flickering. Considering that there are people living in big cities who have never seen stars before in their lives, perhaps one of the most unrealistic aspects of the show is the idea that people all over the world would even notice this flickering. Overall, I think this scene was unnecessarily dumbed down by not just including the cosmic microwave background aspect. And we already get the scene with the Sophon unfolding over Earth a couple episodes later, so we don't even need this global display of power. It was a bad scene. Speaking of the Sophon unfolding scene, that's another scene that doesn't make any sense. And I said I'm gonna get nitpicky here. I'm sorry, this is like, this is the CinemaSins element of the video. So here's the problem with the Sophon unfolding itself, very close over the Earth's surface. Sophons are protons. Sentient supercomputers are not, they're still protons, and they still have the mass of a proton. In the books, it's made very clear that if a Sophon unfolds itself into 2 dimensions, it can be very easily destroyed. It has no width, so it will tear like tissue paper. And then hundreds of years of Trisolaran innovation will just be gone like that. The only time the Sophon does unfold is when it manipulates the CMB, and then it unfolds very far out in space, making a huge sphere around Earth. In the show, the Sophon unfolds like at a level below the clouds, and this just makes absolutely no sense. All you need is one plane crashing through that thing, and the entire Sophon is destroyed. It's a really cool scene visually, and it's like a display of power, but come on, I mean, from the Trisolaran perspective, this makes no sense. And again, I know this is kind of like a CinemaSins type of point. The reason I still bring this up is because I saw a lot of confusion online about the power of the Sophons. I saw people asking, like, why don't the Sophons just kill people? And I think scenes like this are a large part of the reason why people are confused about the Sophon's limitations. If you can just unfold this massive mirror thing over the Earth with no consequences, then why can't you just kill people with the Sophons? You know, if it's not as fragile as an actual proton, why can't you just kill people with it? The fragility of Sophons is a really important plot point in that it limits their power and allows the plot to actually happen. And so, yeah, I think this was a dumb scene. Moving on. Okay, let's talk about Judgment Day, aka Operation Gujang, really quickly. I think this scene is interesting because this is a clear case where Netflix and Tencent took very different approaches to adapting the scene. In Tencent, the show goes out of its way to absolve the characters of any moral responsibility for what's happening on the ship by showing that everyone on the ship is like irredeemably evil. They're all criminals and gangsters, and like the general who helps Wang Miao set up the whole plan talks about how one of the people on the ship personally killed his family, if I'm recalling correctly. It's just so over the top. But then Netflix takes the opposite approach by including children on the ship. It goes out of its way to show that perhaps the majority of people on the ship are just innocent people who happen to have been brainwashed and that it's not really their fault. And therefore, Augie feels even more guilt and responsibility over what her technology has done to the people on the ship, as if Wang Miao in the books didn't feel enough already. Here's the thing. I don't really think the show dwelt enough on this moral decision in order to justify actually showing a bunch of kids get chopped up by invisible wires. The scene itself is very gory, which I suppose bodes well for some of the future seasons because there are some very, very gory scenes in the latter two books. But given how violent this scene was, it's shocking how little setup there was for it. We don't even really find out what the plan is for the nanomaterials until the scene is already happening. The whole sequence feels kind of rushed. And so the only real benefits you get from showing all these kids dying is shock value. I think the scene was most effective when it wasn't actually showing the people getting chopped up and was instead showing Augie and Thomas Wade in the control room just watching everything with the silent beeping in the background and without the pounding music. Those were the most powerful moments there because then we just kind of have this like sinking feeling. You know what they're seeing, but you don't have to actually see it in order to feel how horrifying it is. I don't know, the special effects were cool in both the Tencent and the Netflix versions. The part where the ship turns into a giant stack of pancakes and just kind of falls over on the side of the Panama Canal, that looks really cool. I just wish there had been like something of a middle ground. I wish both of these adaptations didn't have to go to such extremes. Okay, so I have a few other criticisms I want to talk about that didn't really fit into any other section. For one thing, the soundtrack of this show is so boring. There's barely even an opening title sequence on most episodes, but aside from that, there aren't any memorable leitmotifs in the entire show. Instead, it's just kind of the same droning, vaguely dramatic music the entire way through. There's nothing memorable about it. The reason this stands out is because in the Tencent show, there are so many good songs. I constantly find myself, even over a year later, humming songs from that show. The music that plays during the intro sequences is awesome, and there's tons of other great music scattered throughout. There's like 2 volumes of the soundtrack that you can listen to. It's a great soundtrack. This show doesn't have that. It's noticeable. I also think the lighting in this show is really boring, and it stands out when you compare it directly to the Tencent show. Like in the scene I mentioned earlier where Ye Wenjie arrives at Red Coast Base, the lighting is just flat, and the lighting is flat in most of the scenes in the show. In between the lighting and the composition, there were just a lot of really uninspired choices and missed opportunities. Sadly, that is the norm for Netflix shows these days, and just shows in general. And movies. I just don't understand how a show that has this high of a budget, which by the way, $20 million an episode? Why? Where did that money go? Like, most of the show consists of people sitting in rooms talking to each other. There are some big sequences, like the Panama Canal sequence and the sequences in the video games and everything. But aside from that, it's just people talking to each other, and that's fine. But why is it $20 million an episode? Why do television shows have such massively inflated budgets these days? Now, I want to also briefly address some criticisms I've seen of the show online that I don't necessarily agree with. One of these criticisms is that the show has a noticeable lack of idealism compared to the books, a lack of optimism. And I understand why people are saying this, because the books, for all the dark concepts they explore, are very much rooted in a more traditional brand of science fiction, the kind of optimistic space-age science fiction that predated, you know, the more grim science fiction of like the 70s and 80s. It comes from the tradition of like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. These stories that, you know, oftentimes had bad things happen in them, but also kind of portrayed humanity itself in a rather positive light as a bastion of goodness and hope against a dark, oppressive universe. To reference a video I made fairly recently, Liu Cixin is a Type 1 sci-fi world builder. And people are saying the show kind of subverts all that. Humans are no longer portrayed in as positive a light, and partly this is due to there being more morally gray actions, like the whole children on Judgment Day part of the story. But it's also just vibes. The characters themselves in this adaptation lack idealism. If you compare, for example, someone like Augie to someone like Wang Miao, Wang Miao, at the beginning of the story at least, is sort of a blank slate, and he, as the story goes on to represent despair and ultimately hope. Whereas Augie, from the very beginning, is just very kind of beaten down and stays beaten down, and only at the very end does she start to rise up again. The thing is, though, even though I understand where this argument is coming from, I don't really buy that all of the optimism is gone. Humans are still standing up against an evil alien force. They're still coming together to enact these massive plans, and we're only going to see that continue. And anyway, if you've read the books, you know that the books themselves, for all that they are rooted in the more traditional science fiction tradition, they're not necessarily cheerful books. Hopeful, maybe, but not necessarily cheerful, if that distinction makes any sense. This whole discussion about optimism versus pessimism in sci-fi is very much vibes-based, and in truth, I can see both positions. I can see how you might think the books themselves and the show are overly optimistic or overly pessimistic. Regardless, I think this adaptation still sticks closer to the old-school style of science fiction that the books themselves harken to, as opposed to the cyberpunk, grimdark science fiction on the other side of the spectrum. I don't know, this is a complicated question, so I would love to hear what you all have to think about it. Another interesting criticism I've heard, mostly from non-Western viewers, is that by shifting all of the present-day plotlines to the West, and specifically the UK, and keeping the past plotline with Yeo and Jia still in China in the 1960s, the show inadvertently puts China in a position where it like ruins the entire world. Like, you have one woman in the 1960s who sees all these horrible things happening during the Cultural Revolution, and that traumatizes her and convinces her to press the button to send humanity to their doom. And so you might say, if they're shifting all of the other characters to be Western characters, why not shift the past plotline into the West as well? Why not have Yeo and Jia be traumatized by some other event so that you don't unfairly paint China in a bad light? I think there are a few things you could say to this. For one thing, it's not true at all that Yeo and Jia's motivation for wanting Trisolaris to attack Earth was only because of what happened during the Cultural Revolution. Her reading Silent Spring and reading about the use of industrial pesticides in the United States was a huge part of what convinced her that the whole world was messed up. But for another thing, it's not exactly a controversial thing to say that the Cultural Revolution was really, really bad. There's a rich tradition of literature in China called scar literature, which emerged in the wake of Mao's death, and all about the trauma that people faced during the Cultural Revolution. And while this literature was always kind of controlled, at least in China itself, so that you couldn't directly attack Mao or the party. It was still a way of processing the grief and trauma of the Cultural Revolution, and that's very much where these Cultural Revolution scenes in the books are coming from. I think it's quite telling, in fact, that these scenes got censored from the Tencent version of the story, considering that much Scar literature just deals with these factual accounts of struggle sessions and traumatic events during the Cultural Revolution, things that actually happened. However, even on top of that, it's hard for me to imagine the Cultural Revolution plotline being cut out entirely, because it's such an essential part of what makes the three-body problem the three-body problem. And that's not only because of the iconic aesthetics of Red Coast Base and Ye Wenjie working in the camp, it's also because this particular historical time period is thematically relevant to the story. The first episode of this series starts out with a crowd chanting, "Root out the bugs," which is obviously drawing a linguistic parallel between the Trisolarans and the Red Guards. And similarly, the Cultural Revolution was quite unique in that many of the people who were targeted by the violence were researchers, scientists, academics, and these are later on the very same people who were targeted by the Santi. I think there's clearly supposed to be an irony in how Ye Wenjie, her hatred of humanity fueled in part by witnessing the persecution of scientists during the Cultural Revolution, calls down to Earth a superior alien civilization who only end up persecuting scientists even more. And if you cut out this plotline, all of that context is lost. Now, I will say, I have also heard many Chinese viewers pointing out historical and cultural inaccuracies in this show, and I totally understand the frustration with that. Even though I don't have the knowledge or experience to point out many of these inaccuracies myself, I can imagine how frustrating that would be. But commenting solely from a thematic standpoint, I still think it would be a shame if this whole plotline were just cut out and the entire show was made into a purely Western show. That's not to say Netflix achieved perfect representation here by any means. I think the show would be a lot better if more of the present-day characters had their Chinese heritages emphasized, like Jin Cheng, for instance. But I still don't agree with those who say that this is an either-or situation, that the show needs to either be solely Chinese, like the books were, or solely a Western show. I think the showrunners could have achieved just a bit more balance there. Okay, so here is where I'm going to put a spoiler warning for all of the books in the series, because I want to briefly speculate on a couple of things related to where this series might go in the future. This is your warning now. I'm gonna cover everything. Bye, if you want to leave. First of all, regarding where the characters are going in the future, most of their paths seem like they're going to follow the paths of their book counterparts quite closely, except for one character, and that's Augie. Augie is the equivalent of Wang Miao, and Wang Miao doesn't appear at all in the second or the third book. He just vanishes, really. So people are wondering what Augie's role is going to be in the future seasons, and some people are speculating that she might be IAA, Chang Shen's friend in the future who leaves with her to go escape the solar system as it's being flattened. And I think this is a possibility, but I want to raise at least one other possibility, which is that I think Augie could become the Ding Yi equivalent in the next season, which is to say that she would be one of the people who investigates the droplet as it enters the solar system and is then subsequently killed in the droplet attack. The reason I think this might be the case is because it would give the droplet attack a lot of extra punch if a main character died during the attack. This would be quite shocking, and the showrunners have proven so far that they have no reservation with killing off main characters. The same thing goes for Game of Thrones. And it would make sense because Augie doesn't have anything to do for the rest of the seasons. IAA could just be a new character. She doesn't have to become her. That's just completely random speculation. I don't know. I think it would make sense. Let me know what you think. The other thing I wanted to discuss that has huge implications for the show going forward is the Wallfacers. The Wallfacers are handled completely differently in this version of the story. There are 3 of them as opposed to 4 of them, and they're all different people. What's interesting is that the 2 Wallfacers we get, aside from Saul, who is the equivalent of Luo Ji, seem to be the equivalent of Frederick Taylor and Manuel Rey Diaz, respectively. I'm not necessarily sure which is supposed to be which, but the reason I say that is because there are no neuroscientists on the team, like Bill Hines was in the books. Bill Hines seems to be completely cut. And that does make me wonder, is the Neural Seal plotline going to be included in the next season, or is it just going to be completely skipped over? I could understand why they would want to skip over it, because as many book fans have pointed out, the Neural Seal plotline doesn't really go anywhere, but at the same time, it is a really interesting story arc and idea, and it does have some implications for the story, even if it's only in like a secondhand sense. I don't know, I'm 50-50 on this one. Maybe they could include it, maybe they couldn't. It would be cool to see. But if they don't include it, I'm sure the Tencent show will cover it because they stick very closely to the book. So either way, we'll get some version of it. To conclude, finally, this show I think is a perfectly fine way to be introduced to the books. I don't hate it. I don't think it's perfect at all, but it's a great starting point. I personally enjoy books more than TV shows. I think you can just pack so many more interesting ideas into a book than you can in a TV show. In general, even, I'm not a huge fan of TV shows as compared to other media. It feels like they're in this weird limbo between books and movies where they want to be cinematic the way movies are, but they're also trying to have all the strengths of a book with long-form storytelling. And it's just, I don't know. It's not my favorite. I prefer movies and I prefer books. This might just be because lately I've been watching way too many TV shows based on books I like. Maybe I should watch more original shows. I don't know. Ultimately, ever since the show came out, I've seen people talking about sophons and higher dimensional spaces and all these cool ideas that the series introduces. And if this goes on to become even more popular and the terms dual vector foil and dark forest strike make their way into the common parlance, that would be awesome. Unfortunately, I don't think this show is going to have the cultural staying power as the other brainchild of its creators, Game of Thrones. But it has been greenlit for more seasons, so we'll have to see. I really, really hope that it just stops after book 3 and doesn't become so successful that they feel the need to adapt the 4th fanfiction book, which I admittedly haven't read, but which I've read a summary of, and which is apparently really, really bad. I think the 3rd book ends perfectly, and I don't need them to go any farther than that. Anyway, at the end of the day, this is just a TV show, and if you didn't like it, it's not the end of the world. If you enjoyed it, then I'm happy for you. So I'm Nathaniel, this has been Generic Entertainment, and until next time, keep doing your thing. Stay generic. Whatever. I really need to come up with a good way to end these videos.